The church bells had barely stopped ringing when they showed up at my door. 3 black sedans pulled into my driveway like vultures circling carrion. I watched from behind my living room curtains as my late husband's family emerged, dressed in their funeral finest, carrying suitcases. My hands trembled as I gripped the curtain fabric. David had been buried 6 hours ago. 6 hours. And here they were, his parents and his brother Marcus, marching up to the home David and I had shared for 8 years like they owned the place. The doorbell rang. Then again. Then pounding. I opened the door with my funeral dress still on. Mascara streaked down my cheeks. Margaret, my mother-in-law, pushed past me without a word. Her husband Harold followed, dragging a massive suitcase that scraped against my hardwood floors. Marcus brought up the rear, his eyes scanning my home like he was taking inventory. "What are you doing?" The words came out as a whisper. I was still in shock from the day, from losing David so suddenly to that heart attack at 34. Margaret turned to face me, her cold blue eyes cutting through me like winter frost. "We're moving in, Sarah. This house is too big for just you, and frankly, you can't afford it on your little teacher's salary." My mouth opened, but nothing came out. David had been gone for 3 days total. 3 days since I found him collapsed in our kitchen. 3 days since my world imploded. Moving in. I finally managed. Harold dropped his suitcase with a loud thud. David would have wanted his family close to his things. His memory. You understand. I didn't understand anything. My head felt like it was underwater. Everything moved in slow motion as I watched them begin arranging their belongings in my living room. Marcus emerged from the kitchen holding a cup of coffee.
My coffee.
From my machine. "You should probably start thinking about where you'll go, Sarah. This arrangement is temporary until we figure out the estate situation." The estate situation. The words hit me like a slap. Figure out what exactly? My voice grew stronger, anger beginning to burn through the fog of grief. Margaret sat down on my couch like she'd been doing it for years. "Well, dear, David was our son. This house, his life insurance, his investments. We're his next of kin. I'm his wife." "We're his wife," she corrected with cruel precision. Past tense now. The room spun. I grabbed the doorframe to steady myself. In the span of one conversation, I'd gone from widow to homeless. From David's partner to David's afterthought. That night, I lay in my bed listening to them moving around downstairs. Rearranging furniture. Claiming space. Margaret had made hamburgers for dinner and hadn't offered me any. Marcus had taken over David's home office, spreading papers across the desk where David used to pay our bills. I stared at the ceiling and remembered the last real conversation David and I had. Just a week before he died, we'd been lying in this same bed, talking about the future. About maybe having kids soon. About the vegetable garden we wanted to plant in the spring. "I love you more than anything, Sarah," he'd whispered in the dark. "Promise me something. Promise me that if anything ever happens to me, you'll fight for yourself. Don't let anyone push you around." I'd laughed and told him nothing was going to happen. We were young. We had decades ahead of us. Now his parents were downstairs dividing up our life like it was nothing more than a garage sale. The next morning, I found Margaret in the kitchen making breakfast. She'd rearranged everything. My ceramic coffee mugs were gone, replaced with her ugly floral ones. My favorite coffee had been thrown away, the empty bag sitting on top of the garbage. "Good morning, dear," she said without looking up from the eggs she was scrambling. "I've made a list of local apartments that might suit your budget. Nothing fancy, but they'll do." She slid a piece of paper across the counter. Cheap studio apartments on the wrong side of town. Places where gunshots were background music and the hallways smelled like despair. "I'm not going anywhere," I said quietly. Margaret's spatula froze mid-stir. "Excuse me? This is my home. David and I bought it together. We're married. We're married." She turned to face me fully, her expression shifting from dismissive to dangerous. "Sarah, honey, you're grieving. You're not thinking clearly. David never would have put everything solely in your name. He was a smart boy, my David. He protected his assets." The way she said "my David" made my skin crawl. Like I'd been borrowing him for 8 years, and now it was time to return him to his rightful owners. Harold appeared in the doorway, already dressed in one of David's shirts. Seeing my husband's clothes on another man's body was like being stabbed with a rusty knife. "Are we having a problem here?" he asked, looking between Margaret and me. "Sarah seems confused about the living arrangements," Margaret said, her voice dripping false concern. Harold nodded knowingly. Grief does things to people. Makes them irrational. "Sarah, we're trying to be patient with you, but this house has been in our family for generations. David just happened to be the one living in it." That was a lie. David and I had bought this house together. I'd been there for the inspections, the paperwork, the mortgage applications. My name was on everything. Wasn't it? Doubt crept in like poison. I'd trusted David to handle most of the financial details. He was better with numbers, more patient with paperwork. I'd signed where he told me to sign, initialed where he pointed. But had I actually read everything? "I want to see the deed," I said. Margaret and Harold exchanged a look. Quick, but I caught it. "Of course, dear," Margaret said sweetly. "Once we locate all the paperwork. These things take time to sort through." Marcus joined us, wearing David's favorite coffee mug, the one I'd bought him for our first Christmas together. Seeing it in his hands felt like watching someone desecrate a grave. "Sarah, I've been going through David's files," he said, taking a long sip from the mug. "His affairs are more complicated than we initially thought. It might be weeks before everything gets sorted out legally." Weeks. They wanted me to live in limbo for weeks while they systematically erased me from my own life. "I think you should stay with your sister until this gets resolved," Margaret added. "It would be easier for everyone." My sister lived 4 hours away in a cramped apartment with 3 kids under 10. She'd offered to let me stay after David died, but I turned her down because I needed to be home. Needed to be surrounded by David's things, his memory, his presence. Now, they wanted to exile me from the only place that still felt like him. "No," I said. The word came out stronger than I felt. "I'm not leaving." The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Harold set down his coffee cup with deliberate precision. "Sarah, you're being unreasonable. We're trying to help you through this difficult time, but you're making it harder than it needs to be." "Help me?" "You showed up 6 hours after we buried David with suitcases." "We drove straight from the cemetery," Margaret snapped, her mask slipping. "We're grieving too. David was our son long before he was your husband." The possessiveness in her voice was nauseating, like David was a toy they'd never really agreed to share. That afternoon, I locked myself in the master bedroom and called David's lawyer, Mr. Peterson. We'd used him when we bought the house, and David had mentioned updating our wills with him just a few months ago. The phone rang 4 times before he picked up. "Peterson Law Office." "Mr. Peterson, this is Sarah Collins, David Collins' wife. We need to talk." A pause. "Sarah, I'm so sorry for your loss. David was a good man." "Thank you. I need to know about our will." "David's will. His parents are saying things that don't make sense." Another pause, longer this time. "Can you come in tomorrow morning? This isn't really something we should discuss over the phone." My stomach nodded. If everything was straightforward, why couldn't he just tell me? "Is there a problem?" "Just come in tomorrow, Sarah. 9 o'clock. He hung up before I could ask anything else. I sat on my bed holding the silent phone, staring at David's side of our dresser. His wallet was still there, along with his watch and wedding ring. The hospital had given me his ring after he died, and I'd placed it exactly where he always left it at the end of each day.
Such a small thing.
A simple gold band. But it represented everything we'd built together. 8 years of marriage, 10 years of being together total. Late nights talking about our dreams. Early mornings making coffee together in comfortable silence. The way he'd wrap his arms around me while I cooked dinner. The way he'd leave little notes in my lunch bag. All of it reduced to a ring on a dresser and a family who looked at me like I was a stranger. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the house settling felt like an invasion. Margaret and Harold had taken over the guest room, while Marcus had set up a sleeping bag in David's office. They moved through the house like they'd always lived there, like I was the intruder. Around midnight, I heard voices downstairs. Low, urgent whispers. I crept to the top of the stairs and strained to listen. "She's going to be a problem," Margaret was saying. "I can see it in her eyes. She's not going to go quietly." "Let her fight," Harold replied. "She'll exhaust herself and give up. They always do. What if she finds out about?" "She won't," Marcus interrupted. "David made sure of that. Everything's exactly as it should be." My blood turned to ice. Made sure of what? What had David done? I crept back to bed with questions spinning through my mind like tornadoes. David had been secretive the last few months before he died. Working late more often. Taking phone calls in other rooms. Handling bills and paperwork without involving me, which wasn't unusual, but now felt sinister. Had my husband left me with nothing? Had our entire marriage been built on lies? The next morning, I dressed carefully for my meeting with Mr. Peterson. A black suit that David had always said made me look professional and strong. I needed every ounce of strength I could find. Margaret was waiting in the kitchen when I came downstairs. She'd made coffee but hadn't offered me any. A petty power play that felt enormous in my fragile state. "Going somewhere?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew. "To see David's lawyer." She nodded approvingly. "Good. The sooner you understand the reality of your situation, the better for everyone." The drive to Peterson's office felt like a funeral march. Every red light was another moment to imagine the worst. By the time I parked, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely turn off the engine. Mr. Peterson's secretary led me into his office immediately. He was older than I remembered, probably pushing 70, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. The type of man who'd seen every kind of family drama and learned not to judge. "Sarah, please sit down," he said gently. "Can I get you some coffee? Water?" I shook my head. "I just need to know what David left behind. His parents are acting like I have no claim to anything, and I'm starting to think they might be right." Mr. Peterson opened a thick file folder on his desk. "Sarah, I want you to know that David came to see me about 6 weeks before he passed away. He was very specific about his wishes." 6 weeks. Right around the time he'd started acting strangely. He updated his will. He did more than that. He restructured everything. Mr. Peterson pulled out several documents. He was quite concerned about his family's potential reaction to his death. Specifically, he was worried they might try to claim assets that belonged to you both. My heart started beating faster. "What do you mean?" "David told me his parents had always been controlling about money, that they'd never fully accepted you as part of the family. He wanted to make absolutely certain they couldn't manipulate you during your time of grief." Mr. Peterson turned the documents toward me. "Sarah, you are the sole beneficiary of everything. The house, his life insurance, his investment accounts, his retirement funds. Everything. His parents receive nothing." The words hit me like lightning. Nothing. David was very clear. He said his parents had plenty of their own money and that you were his family now. His only family. I stared at the will, seeing my name listed as beneficiary on line after line. The house that Margaret claimed belonged to David's family?
Meaning.
The life insurance policy Harold had been calculating in his head?
Meaning.
Every stock, every bond, every asset David had accumulated? All mine. But why are they so confident? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. They act like they know something I don't. Mr. Peterson's expression darkened. Because David was worried they might try to produce a fraudulent will. He specifically asked me to prepare multiple copies and to register the official version with the county clerk's office where it couldn't be tampered with. The pieces started falling into place. David's secretive behavior, the late-night phone calls, the way he'd suddenly taken over all our financial paperwork. He knew, I whispered. He knew they'd do exactly what they're doing. David loved you very much, Sarah. This will is a love letter. Every provision is designed to protect you and ensure you can live comfortably for the rest of your life. I thought about Margaret making breakfast in my kitchen. Harold wearing David's shirts. Marcus sleeping in David's office, going through papers that belonged to me. There's more, Mr. Peterson continued. David also left instructions for me to handle the estate transfer personally. Your in-laws have no legal standing to make decisions about his assets. None at all. What do I do? Mr. Peterson smiled for the first time since I'd arrived. You go home and inform them that they need to leave immediately. If they refuse, you call the police and have them removed for trespassing. The drive home felt completely different from the drive there. Where I'd been terrified and powerless an hour ago, now I felt like a storm gathering strength. David hadn't abandoned me. He'd protected me in the most thorough way possible. But he'd done more than that. He'd seen his family's true nature clearly enough to anticipate their exact behavior. The suitcases at the funeral. The immediate move to claim territory. The psychological warfare designed to make me doubt myself. He'd known them better than I had. And he'd loved me enough to shield me from them even after death. I pulled into my driveway behind the 3 black sedans that had looked so intimidating yesterday. Now they just looked like obstacles to be removed. Harold was in the front yard, watering plants with my hose. Watering plants that David and I had chosen together, in a yard we'd landscaped ourselves. The casual ownership in his movements made my jaw clench. I walked past him without a word and entered my house. Margaret was in the living room, rearranging our furniture. She'd moved David's favorite chair to a corner and replaced it with an ugly floral monstrosity they must have brought from their own home. "How did it go, dear?" she asked sweetly. "I hope Mr. Peterson helped you understand your situation." Marcus emerged from the kitchen carrying a box. "I've been packing up David's personal items. Things that should stay in the family." In the box, I could see David's college trophies. His watch collection. The leather-bound journal where he wrote down his thoughts. Personal things that belong to me now. "Put the box down," I said quietly. Marcus laughed. "Sarah, these are family heirlooms. They should go to people who'll appreciate their history."
Put
the box down. Something in my tone made him pause. Margaret looked up from the couch. She was rearranging. "Is everything all right, dear?" Margaret asked, but there was wariness in her voice now. I pulled out the will and unfolded it slowly, deliberately. The legal language was dense, but the key phrases stood out like neon signs.
Sole beneficiari.
All assets. No other claims. "I want you to leave," I said, my voice steady and cold. "All of you."
Now.
Harold had come inside and stood dripping in my entryway. "Sarah, you're being dramatic. We've discussed this. You can't afford this place on your own." "I can afford it just fine. Since it's mine. Along with everything else David owned." I held up the will. "David left me everything. The house, the life insurance, all of it. You get nothing." The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret's face went through several color changes before settling on a shade of red I'd never seen on human skin. "That's impossible," she said, but her voice shook. "David wouldn't do that to his own family." David did exactly what he wanted to do, which was protect his wife from people who showed up to his funeral with suitcases. Marcus set down the box with unnecessary force. "There has to be a mistake. David discussed his will with us. He said we'd be taken care of." "When?" I asked sharply. "When did he tell you that?" The 3 of them exchanged looks. Quick, guilty glances that told me everything I needed to know. "You never talked to David about his will," I continued. "You just assumed. You assumed that blood would matter more than the woman he chose to marry. You assumed wrong." Margaret stood up, her composure finally cracking completely. "You manipulated him. A young wife twisting an older man around her fingers. That's what this is." David was 34. I'm 31. Try again. "You isolated him from his family," Harold added, stepping closer. Water from the hose dripped onto my hardwood floors. "Turned him against us." "I didn't have to turn him against you. You did that yourselves." I thought about all the family gatherings where they'd excluded me from conversations. The way they'd talk about David's childhood, like I wasn't there. How they'd give him expensive gifts and hand me token presents that still had clearance stickers on them. I thought about the time Margaret had asked me when David and I were going to have real children, as if the life we'd built together wasn't real enough for her. I thought about Harold's comments about my little teacher salary and how David should find someone more financially ambitious. They'd never accepted me, never tried to. And now they were shocked that David had chosen his wife over the people who'd spent 8 years treating her like a temporary inconvenience. "You have 1 hour to pack your things and get out," I said, folding the will carefully. "If you're not gone by then, I'm calling the police." Margaret's mask slipped completely. "You little gold-digging witch. David was worth more dead than alive to you, wasn't he?" The accusation hit me like a physical blow. That she could look at my grief, my devastation at losing the love of my life, and reduce it to money was beyond cruel. "Get out," I whispered. "We'll contest this," Marcus said, grabbing the box of David's things again. "There are ways to challenge a will, especially when someone's been manipulated. Contest it all you want." David registered the official copy with a county clerk. He also prepared multiple copies and had them witnessed by 3 different people. "He knew you'd try this." That stopped them cold. "He knew?" Margaret asked weakly. "He knew exactly what kind of people you are. He knew you'd show up here with suitcases. He knew you'd try to claim what wasn't yours. He knew you'd try to make me feel like I didn't deserve to inherit from my own husband." I pulled out my phone and started dialing. "What are you doing?" Harold asked. "Calling the police. I've changed my mind about the hour." "Wait," Margaret said quickly. "We'll go. We just need time to pack." "You can pack, but you can't take anything that belonged to David. That box stays here. Those clothes stay here. Any of our belongings, you've helped yourselves to stay here." Harold looked down at the shirt he was wearing. David's shirt. "This is just a shirt. It's my shirt now. Take it off." The next 20 minutes were the most satisfying of my life since David's funeral. I watched his family pack their suitcases with only the things they'd brought. I made Harold change into his own clothes. I took back every mug, every piece of furniture, every small item they'd claimed. Margaret tried one last manipulation as she stood in my doorway. "Sarah, David loved his family. He wouldn't want this animosity between us. We're all grieving." "You're right," I said. "David did love his family. That's why he married me. That's why he made me his family. And that's why he made sure I'd be protected from people who would try to take advantage of my grief." She had nothing to say to that. I watched from my living room window as the 3 black sedans pulled out of my driveway. Just like that, they were gone. The house fell silent in a way it hadn't since they'd arrived. I walked through each room, reclaiming my space. The kitchen where Margaret had rearranged everything. David's office where Marcus had been going through our private papers. The guest room where they'd made themselves at home. It all felt like mine again. That evening, I sat in David's favorite chair, which I'd moved back to its proper place by the window. I held his wedding ring and looked through his journal, reading his thoughts about our life together. One entry, dated just 2 months before he died, stopped me cold. "Sarah doesn't know how much my parents resent her. She tries so hard to win their approval, but they'll never give it. They see her as someone who stole me away from them, when the truth is she saved me from them. I need to make sure she's protected if something happens to me. She's too kind to fight people who aren't fighting fair." Tears rolled down my cheeks as I read his words. David had seen everything clearly. The way his parents treated me. The way they'd react to his death. The way they'd try to manipulate me during my most vulnerable time. And he'd loved me enough to build a fortress around me made of legal documents and careful planning. I kept reading. "If I die before Sarah, she'll try to be understanding. She'll try to accommodate my family, because she thinks that's what I'd want. But what I want is for her to be happy and secure. I want her to know that she was my choice every single day for 8 years, and she'd be my choice for 1,000 more years if I had them." The doorbell rang, interrupting my thoughts. For a moment, panic shot through me. Were they back? But it was just my neighbor, Mrs. Chun, holding a casserole dish. I saw the cars leave, she said gently. Thought you might like some company. Mrs. Chun had been our neighbor for 5 years. She'd watched David and me plant our first garden, paint our front door, hang Christmas lights every December. She'd seen us being happy. Thank you, I said, stepping aside to let her in. I could use the company. As we sat in my living room eating her homemade lasagna, Mrs. Chun asked the question I'd been dreading. Are you going to be okay? Financially, I mean. This house is a lot for one person. I thought about the life insurance policy, the investment accounts, the retirement funds that were now mine. David had been more financially responsible than I'd realized. More protective. I'm going to be fine, I said, and for the first time since he'd died, I meant it. Mrs. Chun studied my face. You look different than you did this morning. Stronger. I found out some things today. Good things. About David. About what he wanted for me. She nodded knowingly. David was a good husband. I used to watch him work in the yard, and he'd always stop to wave at you when you came home from school. Even after all those years of marriage, his face would light up like he was seeing you for the first time. That made me cry again, but they were different tears. Not the desperate tears of grief and fear I'd been crying for 3 days, but tears of gratitude. For having been loved so completely by someone who'd seen me clearly and chosen me anyway. After Mrs. Chun left, I called my sister. How are you holding up? She asked immediately. Better than I was this morning. David's parents tried to take over, but it turns out David left me everything. They had no claim to anything. Of course he did. Sarah, that man worshipped the ground you walked on. Anyone with eyes could see how much he loved you. His parents couldn't see it. His parents didn't want to see it. There's a difference. Over the next few days, I slowly began putting my life back together. I returned David's ring to the jewelry box where he'd kept it before we got married, right next to mine. I framed one of his journal entries about our happiness and put it on his dresser. I called the school district and arranged to take bereavement leave for the rest of the semester. Between David's life insurance and savings, I could afford to take time to grieve properly without his family circling like vultures. Mr. Peterson called to check on me and to confirm that David's assets were being transferred smoothly. No contests to the will had been filed. Apparently, Margaret, Harold, and Marcus had consulted their own lawyer, who told them they had no case. David really did think of everything, Mr. Peterson told me. I've been practicing law for 40 years, and I've never seen someone prepare so thoroughly for his family's potential reaction to his death. He knew them better than I did. He also knew you better than you know yourself. This will isn't just about money, Sarah. It's about David making sure you'd never have to compromise your kindness or your principles to survive. 2 weeks after the confrontation, Margaret called me. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won. Sarah, she said, her voice different from before. Smaller. We need to talk. I don't think we do.
Please.
Just 5 minutes. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet her at the coffee shop where David and I had had our first date. Neutral ground. Margaret looked like she'd aged 10 years in 2 weeks. Her perfectly styled hair was disheveled, and her makeup couldn't hide the dark circles under her eyes. I owe you an apology, she said as soon as I sat down. I waited. We were wrong. About everything. Our lawyer explained that David had every right to leave his assets to you, and that the way we handled things was inappropriate. Inappropriate is one word for it. Margaret winced. We were grieving too, Sarah. We lost our son. I lost my husband, and instead of supporting each other, you tried to make me homeless. She stared into her coffee cup. David called me about 2 months before he died. He said he was worried about his health, about his heart. He wanted to make sure his affairs were in order. My chest tightened. David had been having chest pains before he died, but he'd brushed them off as stress. He told me he was updating his will to make sure you were protected. I told him that was smart, that you'd need security. But I thought he meant he was adding you as a beneficiary, not making you the only beneficiary. He was protecting me from you. Margaret nodded miserably. He knew us better than we knew ourselves. He said we'd try to control the situation if something happened to him. That we'd try to manage you like we'd tried to manage him his whole life. She looked up at me with tears in her eyes. He was right. We showed up to your house with suitcases 6 hours after the funeral. What kind of people do that? The kind of people who see their son's wife as a temporary placeholder instead of a permanent family member. You're right. We never accepted you. We thought David would outgrow you, find someone more like us. We were waiting for your marriage to fail. The honesty was brutal, but I appreciated it more than years of fake politeness. David never would have outgrown me, I said quietly. We grew together. I know that now. Seeing how thoroughly he protected you, how much thought he put into making sure you'd be okay without him. I've never seen love like that. Margaret reached across the table like she might take my hand, then thought better of it. We'd like to be part of your life, if you'll let us. Not as David's parents trying to control his widow, but as people who loved the same man you did. I thought about it. The grief counselor I'd started seeing had talked about the importance of having connections to David's memory. People who'd known him before me, who could share stories I'd never heard. I might be willing to try, I said slowly, but there have to be boundaries. This is my house, my life, my decisions. I'm not looking for parents or guidance. I'm looking for people who can respect that David chose me to be his family. Margaret nodded eagerly. Whatever you need. Whatever boundaries you want. And if you ever try to manipulate me or take advantage of my grief again, you'll never see me again. David made sure I have the resources to disappear completely if I need to. I understand. We didn't hug when we said goodbye, but we didn't part as enemies either. It felt like the beginning of something different. Not warm, not close, but honest in a way our relationship had never been before. Over the following months, Margaret kept her word. She'd call every few weeks to check on me, always asking permission before visiting. She brought me pictures of David as a child that I'd never seen. Stories about his college years before we met. Harold took longer to come around, but eventually he started joining our occasional coffee meetings. He was stiffer than Margaret, less comfortable with emotions, but he tried. Marcus never apologized. I heard through Margaret that he'd moved to another state, apparently too embarrassed by his behavior to face me again. That was fine with me. Some bridges are better left burned. 6 months after David's death, I was finally ready to go through his things properly. Not the urgent, protective sorting I'd done when his family was threatening to take everything, but the slow, loving process of deciding what to keep, what to donate, and what to transform into memorializations. I found more journal entries about me, about us. David had been documenting our happiness with the thoroughness of someone who knew it might not last forever. Reading his words was like having conversations with him again. In one entry, he'd written about the day he decided to update his will. Had another episode today. Chest pain that lasted almost an hour. Sarah wanted me to go to the hospital, but I convinced her it was just stress. I need to see Peterson and get everything legal arranged. If something happens to me, my parents will descend on Sarah like locusts. She's too pure to see them clearly, too kind to fight dirty. But I can fight dirty for her, even from beyond the grave. He'd been planning to protect me while hiding his health concerns, so I wouldn't worry. Taking care of me even while he was dying. The last entry in his journal was dated just 3 days before his heart attack. 10 years together today. Not our wedding anniversary, but the anniversary of our first date at Morrison's coffee shop. Sarah doesn't remember the date, but I do. 10 years since the day my real life started. If I could go back and change anything, I would. I'd tell her I loved her sooner. I'd worry less about money and work and spend more time just enjoying her. I'd take better care of my health, so we could have 50 more years together. But I can't change anything, so I'll just love her as completely as I can for whatever time we have left. I held the journal against my chest and cried for everything we'd lost and everything we'd had. David had loved me with the kind of completeness that most people only dream about. He'd seen me clearly, chosen me daily, and protected me even after death. A year later, I was sitting in the same coffee shop where I'd met with Margaret, but this time I was alone, reading and grading papers. Teaching again felt good. Being around teenagers reminded me that life continues, that there's always hope for new beginnings. A man at the counter was ordering coffee with the kind of specific instructions that marked him as either high maintenance or particular about quality. As he waited for his drink, he glanced around the shop and caught my eye. "Excuse me," he said, walking over. "I'm sorry to bother you, but are you a teacher?" I looked down at the stack of essays I was grading. What gave me away? He smiled. The red pen and the patient expression. "I'm a teacher too. High school history." We talked for 20 minutes about the challenges of engaging modern students, the politics of school administration, and the satisfaction of seeing kids understand difficult concepts. His name was Michael. He was funny and passionate about education, and completely respectful when I mentioned I was widowed. He didn't ask for my number, but he said he hoped to see me at the coffee shop again. It felt like the beginning of something, though I wasn't sure what. That night, I sat in David's chair and told him about my day. About Michael, about the strange flutter of possibility I'd felt during our conversation, about the guilt of feeling anything positive toward another man. "I don't know if I'm ready," I said out loud to the empty room. "I don't know if I'll ever be ready, but I think you'd want me to be open to happiness if it comes." The house was quiet, but it felt less empty than it had in months. I looked at David's picture on the mantel, at the ring I still wore on my right hand, at the life we'd built together that no one could ever take away. David had protected me in death more thoroughly than most husbands protect their wives in life. He'd given me financial security, legal security, and emotional security. He'd made sure I'd never have to depend on people who didn't value me. But most importantly, he'd loved me completely enough that I knew what real love looked like. If I ever chose to love again, I'd know what to look for. I'd never settle for less than someone who chose me as completely as David had. That was his final gift to me. Not just protection from his family, not just financial independence, but the knowledge of what I deserved. The confidence to demand it. As I turned off the lights and headed upstairs, I thought about the woman I'd been a year ago. Devastated, vulnerable, easy to manipulate. David's family had counted on my grief and kindness, making me weak. They'd underestimated both my strength and David's love. I owned everything now. Not just the house and the bank accounts, but my own power, my own choices, my own future. David had made sure of that. The will had been about more than money. It had been about love, protection, and trust. It had been David's way of saying that even death couldn't break the promises we'd made to each other. I fell asleep that night holding his journal, surrounded by the life we'd built together, protected by the love that would outlast both of us. Outside, the house stood solid and secure. Inside, I dreamed of gardens we'd never planted and conversations we'd never had, but also of possibilities I wasn't ready to name yet. Time would tell what came next. But whatever it was, I'd face it as the woman David had loved and protected. Strong enough to fight for myself, wise enough to recognize real love, and secure enough to choose happiness on my own terms. His family had taught me what love wasn't. David had shown me what love was. Now I had the rest of my life to honor both lessons. The will had given me everything, but everything had started long before the lawyers and the legal documents. It had started with a man who'd seen me clearly and chosen me completely. That was the inheritance that truly mattered.